The knocking didn't stop as my daughter slept upstairs and a woman whispered my husband's name through wood. I opened the door while rain soaked her coat, and a child clung to her legs, shaking silently. She pushed an envelope into my hands as her fingers trembled and the papers inside slid loose. I saw the word paternity, while she said he was dead to me but alive to her. My breath caught because my husband had been buried 5 years ago under wet English soil, and the child beside her was born long after the funeral flowers had already rotted. I stood there holding that envelope the way you hold something sharp you're afraid to drop, because you already feel the cut coming. The hallway light flickered above us, and the rain kept falling as if the night itself didn't want to listen. The woman didn't step inside, and I didn't invite her, because neither of us was ready to cross that line yet. My house had been quiet for years, not peaceful, just quiet in the way places become after grief settles into the walls. The kind of quiet where you stop expecting footsteps that will never come back. And I had learned to live inside that silence because fighting it only made it louder. She finally spoke again, not louder, not softer, just steady. She said my husband's name the way someone does when they've practiced it in their head for a long time. And when she said it, I felt something old and buried shift inside me, like soil disturbed too quickly. I told her she had the wrong house because that was the only sentence I could reach without falling apart. She didn't argue and she didn't plead. She just nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that response. Then she looked past me toward the staircase, and her eyes softened for a second. That was when I noticed the child properly. He couldn't have been more than 4, and he wasn't crying, just watching me with the kind of tired curiosity children have when adults fail them. One hand was wrapped tightly around her coat, and the other held a toy car with one wheel missing. I told her again she needed to leave because my daughter was asleep upstairs, and I didn't want this moment to follow me into her dreams. The woman inhaled and finally stepped forward just enough to slide something onto the small table by the door. Not forcing it into my hands, not dramatic, just placing it there and letting go. It wasn't the papers that caught my attention first. It was the ring. It lay there dull under the light, thicker than fashion demanded, scratched along one edge where the metal had never quite been smooth. I knew that scratch because years ago I'd tried to polish it out while standing at this same table, and Mark had laughed and told me to leave it alone. My throat tightened as my eyes traced that familiar damage because the police had told me his belongings were unrecoverable. They'd said the fire had destroyed everything, and I'd believe them because believing was easier than asking more questions. The woman watched my face carefully now, not with triumph, but with something closer to caution. She said she didn't steal it, and she didn't explain how she had it, only that Mark had given it to her himself. And she stopped talking after that, as if she understood that silence was doing the work for her. I picked up the envelope slowly while my fingers refused to cooperate and slid the papers halfway out. I didn't read everything. I didn't need to, because my eyes locked onto the words that shouldn't have existed together. Paternity, confirmed. I remember the strange detail that the font was ordinary, nothing dramatic, nothing that matched how violently my world had tilted. And I remember thinking absurdly that the printer ink looked cheap, like it had no right carrying something this heavy. I told her she was mistaken while my voice shook in a way I didn't recognize anymore. She didn't interrupt me and she didn't correct me. She just waited as if she'd already lived through this part in her head. Then she said one sentence, quietly, carefully. He was still alive when my son was conceived. My ears rang as the words settled because Mark had been declared dead a year before that date. 5 years gone. A funeral held, condolences delivered, insurance paperwork signed, a life closed. And suddenly none of it felt solid anymore. I stepped back from the table because the room felt too small and the air felt borrowed. I asked her what she wanted and she shook her head slowly, as if that question had no simple answer. She said she only wanted me to know because she was tired of being lied to. That was the moment something changed inside me, not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly. I realized she wasn't here to destroy my life because whatever had happened had already done that. She was here because the same man had broken us both in different ways. I told her to leave then, not because I didn't believe her, but because I needed my house to stay mine for one more night. She nodded and gathered the child, hesitating only long enough to tell me her name before stepping back into the rain. The door closed behind her with a sound that felt heavier than it should have. I locked it out of habit and leaned against it while my knees threatened to give way. Upstairs, my daughter shifted in her sleep and murmured something soft that reminded me why I was still standing. I slid down slowly until I was sitting on the floor, the envelope clutched against my chest. I didn't cry then. I didn't scream or throw anything or call anyone. I just listened to my life fall apart. I didn't sleep that night, and not because I was afraid, but because my mind refused to settle anywhere safe. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that ring sitting on my table as if it had never left this house at all. The scratch caught the light differently now, like it was mocking how well I thought I knew my own marriage. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the house still smelled damp and unfamiliar. I made breakfast for my daughter with hands that moved on memory alone while my thoughts stayed locked on one date printed inside that envelope. A date that existed 1 year after my husband was officially declared dead. I didn't mention the knock or the woman or the child because some truths feel too heavy to pass through a child's ears. Instead, I smiled, packed a lunch, tied shoelaces, and waved as she walked down the street toward school. Only when the door closed again did my chest finally tighten enough to hurt. I sat at the kitchen table and spread the papers out slowly, as if they might bite me if I moved too fast. The report didn't shout or accuse or dramatize anything. It simply existed, cold and clinical. Names, dates, signatures, and one quiet sentence confirming what shouldn't have been possible. I noticed then how official it all looked and how ordinary that made it feel. No grand conspiracy language, no alarming red stamps, just routine confirmation delivered without emotion. That was what scared me most, how normal it all appeared. I rang the number printed at the bottom of the page because I needed to hear a human voice tell me this wasn't a mistake. The woman on the line spoke gently, professionally, and with the kind of patience reserved for people already in distress. She confirmed the process, the verification, the controls, and then paused before saying there was no margin for error. I thanked her automatically and ended the call while my hand shook against the counter. There was no dramatic collapse, no tears spilling over, just a hollow sensation spreading behind my ribs. As if something vital had quietly stepped out of me and shut the door behind it. I thought about Mark then, not as the man I'd buried, but as the man I'd lived with. I replayed small moments I'd dismissed over the years, not arguments, not betrayals, just absences. Late nights explained away, sudden trips framed as work emergencies, unexplained cash withdrawals brushed off as accounting issues. At the time, they hadn't felt suspicious, because love has a way of smoothing sharp edges. And grief later had wrapped those memories in kindness, softening everything into something bearable. Now, with that envelope open in front of me, every softened edge turned sharp again. I pulled out the old insurance folder from the cupboard where I'd kept it untouched since the payout cleared. It still smelled faintly of cardboard and dust, like something meant to stay buried. I flipped through pages slowly, noticing how many forms I'd signed without ever questioning the process. The death certificate looked official enough, stamped and dated, but something about it felt thinner now. The hospital name printed at the top stirred a memory I hadn't fully examined before. I remembered being told his body had been transferred before I arrived, moved for safety reasons, documentation completed on my behalf. At the time, I'd been grateful for the efficiency. Now, I wondered who efficiency had really served. I rang the hospital and asked a simple question, pretending I needed records for personal closure. They transferred me twice before a man finally explained that older files were archived off-site and would take time to retrieve. He didn't sound suspicious, just tired, as if requests like mine happen more often than people realized. That was when I understood something uncomfortable. This hadn't been a perfect crime. It had been a patient one. I searched through old emails next, scrolling past condolences, funeral arrangements, and messages I'd stopped reading halfway through. Then I found one from Mark sent just days before the accident, short and unusually vague. He'd said he might be unreachable for a while and asked me not to worry. I'd forgotten it completely until that moment. Now it sat there, quiet and incriminating, like it had been waiting for me to notice. I didn't confront anyone, and I didn't call the police because instinct told me this wasn't the moment for noise. If Mark had built a second life, then silence was what had protected him. And silence, I realized, might protect me too. That afternoon, I drove past places he used to frequent without stopping, just observing. The old petrol station, the bank branch, the solicitor's office where we'd signed our wills. Everything looked unchanged, which made the life feel even larger. I parked outside the cemetery without going in, gripping the steering wheel while memories pressed in from all sides. I thought about the grave I'd stood beside, the earth I'd watched fall, the finality I'd accepted, without question. And for the first time, doubt crept in where grief used to live. I didn't cry then either. Instead, something steadier took its place, something colder and far more dangerous. A certainty that whatever had happened, it hadn't ended 5 years ago. It was still unfolding, and I was standing right in the middle of it. He hadn't just left me. He had planned it. I stopped asking questions out loud because questions change people's behavior, and I needed everyone exactly as they were. Silence, I learned, keeps routines intact, and routines make liars careless. So I folded myself back into normal life while something sharp stayed awake inside me. I still walked my daughter to school and waved to the same parents who smiled without curiosity. I still worked my hours and paid bills and answered messages with polite delay. Nothing about me looked like a woman quietly dismantling a lie. Behind that calm, I began watching instead of remembering. Memory had been too forgiving, too kind, too eager to explain away what didn't fit. Observation, I realized, was colder and far more accurate. I started with the bank because money always tells the truth eventually. I didn't accuse or demand. I simply requested historical statements under the excuse of reorganizing records. No one resisted because widows asking for clarity are easy to accommodate. Patterns appeared slowly, like bruises rising after the impact. Small transfers that didn't align with household expenses, accounts that had been opened and quietly closed. Nothing illegal on its own, just incomplete. I let weeks pass before contacting the insurance company again. I told them I was considering moving and needed to review beneficiary details for tax purposes. The representative was helpful, routine, and unaware she was outlining the frame of a crime. She mentioned follow-up correspondence sent after the payout. Mail that had been marked received. Mail I had never seen. I thanked her and hung up while my pulse stayed steady, disappointingly calm. The shock had already burned itself out. What remained was focus. I didn't confront the woman who'd come to my door, either. I didn't call her, didn't text, didn't ask for explanations. I understood now that her presence alone had already done its work. Instead, I watched the digital traces Mark had left behind. Old email accounts I'd once considered inactive, subscriptions he'd insisted on managing himself. They hadn't been used recently, but inactivity can be as revealing as use. One afternoon, an automated alert appeared on a dormant account. A password recovery attempt from a location 2 hours north of US. I didn't react. I didn't change anything. I let it happen. Over the next month, more alerts followed, subtle and irregular. Access attempts, logins, minor account activity that suggested someone was checking what still belonged to them. Checking what was still safe. That was when I understood the advantage I hadn't known I possessed. Legally, nothing had changed. I was still his wife. I spoke to a solicitor without revealing everything. Hypotheticals only, framed carefully, as if I were asking out of academic curiosity. She listened, nodded, and answered in a way that told me exactly how patient the law could be. Certain accounts required spousal consent. Certain assets could not be moved quietly. Certain identities collapsed the moment scrutiny became formal. I thanked her and said I needed time to think. What I really needed was time for him to keep believing he was invisible. Weeks passed, and then something unexpected happened. A letter arrived addressed to Mark. Not forwarded, not redirected, just delivered to my door, as if the system itself had hesitated. I stared at the name printed there longer than I should have. I didn't open it immediately. I made tea, washed a mug, and waited for my hands to stop shaking. When I finally did, it was a routine notice, administrative and dull. It confirmed an address update request had been denied due to incomplete verification. A polite way of saying someone had tried to move quietly and failed. I sat there listening to the clock tick because I knew what that meant. He was close enough to care now, close enough to panic. The silence between us grew heavier, stretched across counties and years and lies. I imagined him checking balances, refreshing pages, reassuring himself nothing had changed. And I stayed exactly where I was. One evening, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring until it stopped, then rang again. And again. When I finally answered, I said nothing. I listened. His voice had aged differently than I'd imagined, thinner, cautious, wrapped in false warmth. He asked how I was, as if that question still belonged to him. He said my name carefully, testing whether it still responded. I let the silence stretch until he filled it himself. Explanations without prompts, reassurances without accusations. People reveal more when they're afraid of being cut off. He said he'd heard rumors, that someone had contacted me, that he was worried about confusion. I said nothing. And he kept talking. He mentioned finances unprompted, mentioned protection, mentioned things only a man guarding a lie would mention. That was the moment something inside me snapped, quietly but completely. Not into rage, not into grief, but into clarity. You didn't fake your death to escape life. You did it to control it. The line stayed in my throat, unspoken. Out loud, I simply asked how he'd found my number. He laughed nervously and said some things never really disappear. I agreed and ended the call without warning. After that, the mistakes came faster. Accounts locked unexpectedly, documents flagged for review. Processes slowed by questions he couldn't answer without stepping into the light. I didn't push. I didn't rush. I watched, because when someone believes they're running out of time, they start reaching. And reaching leaves fingerprints everywhere. By the end of that month, I had everything I needed without ever raising my voice. Not proof yet, not exposure, just the map of where the lie would collapse under pressure. I tucked it all away and returned to my routine. Packed lunches, answered emails, paid bills, and waited. Because the grave he dug wasn't in the ground. It was in paperwork, timelines, and the assumption that I would stay quiet forever. He was wrong about that. Pressure doesn't arrive loudly. It settles in slowly, like damp creeping through walls you thought were solid. By now, every day felt heavier than the last, not because anything obvious had happened, but because too many things almost had. I could feel him moving even when I couldn't see him. Through delays, through sudden hesitations in systems that used to respond instantly. Through the way silence on his end began to stretch longer than comfort allowed. I kept my routine unchanged because predictability makes people reckless. School runs, work hours, polite conversations with neighbors who still spoke his name in past tense. They didn't know they were participating in a lie that was beginning to suffocate its creator. Another letter arrived, this one marked urgent, this one addressed incorrectly. A clerical error, small on paper, catastrophic in context. Mistakes like that don't happen unless someone is tugging too hard at threads meant to stay loose. I rang the solicitor again, still hypothetically, still calmly. She asked more pointed questions this time, not because I'd changed my tone, but because the situation had changed its shape. Certain safeguards, she said, had activated automatically. Automatic systems don't accuse. They observe. I started receiving notifications I hadn't signed up for. Reviews, audits, verification pauses. The kind of friction that doesn't stop a machine, but forces a human behind it to reveal themselves. He rang more often now. Sometimes late, sometimes early, always with a reason that didn't quite justify the call. I answered less and listened more. When I did speak, I stayed neutral, careful, boring. Nothing unsettles someone hiding better than the absence of reaction. They need emotion to measure distance. He asked about my plans, about whether I'd thought of moving, about money, framed as concern. I told him nothing new, and each time his voice tightened just a little more. At night, sleep became shallow, not from fear, but from anticipation. The sense that something was approaching whether I was ready or not. I reviewed timelines again and again, lining dates up against records, against emails, against signatures. The picture was no longer confusing. It was precise. The accident report contradicted the hospital transfer time. The insurance approval predated certain confirmations. And his digital footprint didn't disappear, it paused. Pauses are intentional. Deaths are not. I sat at the kitchen table one evening and realized my hands were steady. That frightened me more than shaking ever had. It meant my body had already accepted the truth. Another call came, this one frantic beneath the politeness. He spoke faster, laughed at the wrong moments, filled gaps before I could answer. I let him. He said he was thinking of coming back. Just visiting, just to see. He said it was like a test. My stomach tightened because proximity would change everything. Distance has protected us both in different ways. And I knew if he crossed it, the story would end one way or another. I told him that wouldn't be wise. Not firmly, not threateningly, just enough to register. There was a pause then long enough to expose fear. He asked why. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence press in from all sides, because the truth is very close now. The words stayed inside me. Out loud, I said I was tired and ended the call. The next day, two things happened almost at once. An account he depended on froze pending verification. And a formal notice was issued requesting in-person identification. Not an accusation. An invitation. I felt something shift then, subtle but irreversible. The pressure was no longer theoretical. It was operational. He sent messages I didn't respond to. Longer now, more emotional, more exposed. People unravel differently when they realize silence is no longer neutral. I still didn't confront him. I didn't warn him. I let the systems do what systems do when pushed too far. By the end of the week, I knew he was cornered. Not trapped yet, but aware of the walls. Aware that the version of himself he'd built was starting to crack. I stood in my daughter's room one night watching her sleep, steady and unaware. And I understood what this moment really was. Not revenge. Not justice yet. Preparation. Because when pressure peaks, it doesn't explode randomly. It forces a reveal. And that reveal was coming. Whether he chose it or not. He couldn't hide much longer. The invitation arrived on plain paper, worded carefully, without accusation or drama. A request for verification, a routine procedural step, nothing more. But routine is dangerous when your entire life depends on remaining invisible. I didn't attend alone. Not because I needed protection, but because witnesses change behavior. The solicitor sat beside me, quiet, observant, her notebook closed as if already full. He arrived late. Late enough to suggest hesitation, not confidence. And when he walked in, I felt something unexpected. Not fear. Recognition. He looked smaller than the man I had buried, not physically, but structurally. Like a building that still stands but no longer supports weight the way it once did. The room adjusted to him, not the other way around. He smiled when he saw me, instinctive and wrong. That smile had worked for years, softened arguments, dissolved suspicion, reset narratives. Today, it landed nowhere. The officer began with neutral questions. Name, confirmation, date of birth, residency. Each answer pulled from him slower than the last. I didn't read everything. I didn't need to, because my eyes locked onto the words that shouldn't have existed together. Paternity, confirmed. I remember the strange detail that the font was ordinary, nothing dramatic, nothing that matched how violently my world had tilted. And I remember thinking absurdly that the printer ink looked cheap, like it had no right carrying something this heavy. I told her she was mistaken while my voice shook in a way I didn't recognize anymore. She didn't interrupt me and she didn't correct me. She just waited as if she'd already lived through this part in her head. Then she said one sentence, quietly, carefully. He was still alive when my son was conceived. My ears rang as the words settled because Mark had been declared dead a year before that date. 5 years gone. A funeral held, condolences delivered, insurance paperwork signed, a life closed. And suddenly none of it felt solid anymore. I stepped back from the table because the room felt too small and the air felt borrowed. I asked her what she wanted and she shook her head slowly, as if that question had no simple answer. She said she only wanted me to know because she was tired of being lied to. That was the moment something changed inside me, not loudly, not dramatically, just firmly. I realized she wasn't here to destroy my life because whatever had happened had already done that. She was here because the same man had broken us both in different ways. I told her to leave then, not because I didn't believe her, but because I needed my house to stay mine for one more night. She nodded and gathered the child, hesitating only long enough to tell me her name before stepping back into the rain. The door closed behind her with a sound that felt heavier than it should have. I locked it out of habit and leaned against it while my knees threatened to give way. Rights explained, movements restricted, options narrowed. I didn't watch him leave. I watched the table where the lie finally collapsed under its own weight. Paper stacked neatly where a life had been poorly folded. Outside, the air felt different. Not lighter, not freer. Just honest. People passed by without knowing what had just ended in that room. And I realized closure rarely looks like celebration. It looks like quiet acknowledgement. As we walked away, the solicitor asked if I was all right. I nodded because for the first time in years, that answer was accurate. Behind us, the story would spread through files, systems, and official language. Identity fraud. False death declaration. Financial deception. But for me, it ended there. In a room where silence finally gave way to record. The power had shifted. I walked out of that office without ceremony, without triumph, because triumph tastes different when it comes at the cost of 5 years of your own life. The air smelled ordinary, rain had stopped for good, and the streets were the same ones I had known before all of this began. Nothing looked changed, yet everything had shifted beneath my feet. My daughter played quietly in the living room, unaware that the man she had never known as alive had just been unmasked. I watched her, a small smile on her lips, and felt a weight lift, not entirely gone, but managed. Life continued in its own steady rhythm, indifferent to deceit, and that rhythm became my ally. I checked all accounts, properties, and documents one final time. Everything he had tried to claim, hide, or manipulate was now secured by law, by process, and by truth. No anger needed. No confrontation necessary. Systems did the work that rage cannot. I thought about the insurance money he had attempted to claim. The sum felt tainted, unearned, heavy. I quietly donated it to charity, selecting causes that would benefit children, the innocent victims of circumstance. It was justice without spectacle, reparation without drama. For months after, I allowed myself to feel ordinary. Tea in the morning, homework with my daughter, walks down streets that remembered nothing. I had learned that authority doesn't always roar. Sometimes it waits, calm and patient, until lies collapse under their own weight. I never contacted Elena again. I didn't need to. Her purpose had been served in showing the truth, and mine had been served in ensuring it endured. I told my daughter, softly one evening, truth always finds its way. She didn't fully understand, but the words settled like seeds. One day, she might comprehend the weight and the quiet strength it takes to uphold them. Sometimes I catch myself wondering how different life would have been had I ignored the signs. Had I trusted everything at face value? Had I not watched, waited, and let the systems enforce what hearts cannot? The lesson is simple, grounded, and difficult. Patience and observation often win over emotion and haste. Your life may feel small, the world may feel cruel, but calculated silence and strategic patience allow you to reclaim control when betrayal strikes. I ask myself, and now I ask you, how long are you willing to wait before noticing the cracks beneath the surface of your life? Are you observing quietly, or reacting loudly to the chaos that may already be shaping your future? Even in the quiet, authority exists. Even in patience, power is reclaimed. I took back my life without a scream, without a bang, and without losing myself.